Welcome to ArchiTreat's Food for Thought, sponsored by Friends of the Alabama Archives. First things first, please turn off or silence cell phones before we begin. We invite you to plan now to join us next week on September 23rd for a bonus ArchiTreats by Jean Dowdle, author of Cotton and Race in the Making of America, The Human Cost of Economic Power. In October, we will feature two ArchiTreats programs, beginning with a bonus ArchiTreats on October 14th with Glenn Browder representing a panel discussion on stealth reconstruction. And our regular ArchiTreats on October 21st, Vernon James Knight will present The Search for Mobilla. Check our website at www.archives.alabama.gov for more information. Or if you would like an email reminder before each program, we have a sign-up sheet in the lobby. Just leave your email address and I'll send you one each month. Today's speaker has been on Auburn University's journalism faculty since 1983. He serves as the journalism internship supervisor and for 23 years has served as the faculty advisor of the Auburn Plainsman, the award-winning campus newspaper. Many of you have a copy of it today. He established a scholarship in journalism that will be awarded each year to a journalism student who works at the Auburn Plainsman. During his career, he has worked with 2 weekly and 2 daily newspapers in Alabama. He is author of The Press of Alabama, A History of the Alabama Press Association, to commemorate the Press Association's 125th anniversary in 1996. Now to present all the news that's fit we print. Community journalism in Alabama. Please welcome Ed Williams.
Thanks, Sherry. It's good to be with you here today and to participate in the Archives lecture series and to talk about something that's always been a love of mine. That's community journalism. I came to Auburn 27 years ago this fall after working on 4 different community newspapers, as Sherry mentioned. And even during the time that I've been in Auburn for 23 years, I've served as the faculty advisor of our student newspaper, the Auburn Plainsman. I put a copy of the day's issue there on the overhead, and I hope you'll pick one up on your way out. We're also online. We found that most people still like to read the paper in print. This morning, the paper came out, and when I had a 9:30 class, and there were students who were in class reading the paper before class started. My window there in Tishner Hall faces out on the concourse, and I saw students on the concourse sitting on benches reading the Plainsman. They weren't reading it online, even though the Plainsman, the campus is wired for wireless connection. They were reading that print newspaper. I mentioned to you that my entire journalism career was spent in Alabama. But I had a fun experience several years ago when I received a fellowship from the American Press Institute to go for the summer as a visiting professor and work at a newspaper. And I put in my application that I would like to work at a newspaper outside of the South, that I'd like to work somewhere else and see what it was like working on a newspaper in another part of the country. Well, I wound up that summer in northeastern Ohio near Lake Erie, and I worked at a newspaper that was called the Chronicle-Telegram, and it was in Elyria, Ohio, in Lorain County, just west of Cleveland. What was especially enjoyable to me about that experience that summer was that Elyria, Lorain County, was near Wayne and Holmes counties, which happened to have the largest concentration of Amish people in the world. About 32,000 Amish people lived in that area. While I was there, I became familiar with a little newspaper called The Budget. The newspaper is written by and for the large Amish population in that area. And each week I would stop in a convenience store in Ohio and pick up a copy of The Budget. Just a few weeks ago, The Budget was featured on National Public Radio. It said that at a time when newspapers are struggling, that this weekly newspaper continues to thrive. That's because The Budget knows its audience. The budget thinks of itself as kind of a 19th century Facebook. It connects its subscribers, many people who don't have electricity or telephones, with Amish friends and families scattered in Amish and Mennonite communities all over the world. The budget serves several purposes. It chronicles history and culture. It reports on the weather and farming practices. And this newspaper has even served several people by helping them to get a Social Security number because the children were born at home and not in a hospital, and the newspaper copy verified the birth of that child. The budget, as you can see, it's a simple newspaper. No fancy advertising, no high-gloss pages, but it serves a community of people and more just by recording everyday life. Unlike most weekly newspapers, though, the budget doesn't have paid staff. It uses hundreds of Amish volunteers that it calls scribes, and they share stories and write about the weather, births, deaths, farm accidents, in long columns with no photographs. Big news on page 1 was this. My husband and I were taking a noon rest on the porch in our reclining chairs. My husband was holding real still, and he told me that he had a bird in his hair. It reminded me of some of the great and memorable stories that I've read in Alabama community newspapers that I want to share with you today. Community newspapers record everyday life. And like the budget, much of the news is written not by scribes, but by community correspondents. At a time when many newspapers are experiencing declining circulation and readership, community newspapers, for the most part, are doing fine. That's because they know their audiences. Don't look for national news in a community newspaper. The typical community paper contains a record of weekly events, some profound and some not so profound, that influence the lives of the readers in that community. Community newspapers connect the readers with one another, sort of like a Facebook, as NPR called it. Small-town newspapers are quite influential in the communities that they serve. As we meet here today near the Capitol and the Alabama State House, I venture to say that an Alabama lawmaker would far rather than a newspaper article critical of him appear in the Montgomery Advertiser than in his hometown newspaper. If a legislator were arrested for DUI, I think it's safe to say that he would rather that story be in the state's largest newspaper, the Birmingham News, than in his little hometown weekly newspaper. In Alabama and every state for that matter, the community newspaper is the source that the majority of readers turn to be informed, entertained, and influenced. Small-town papers have a role that's much different than the metropolitan dailies. Much of the news that you read in your hometown newspaper would never appear in the Birmingham News or the Montgomery Advertiser or the Mobile Register or the Huntsville Times or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. One of my favorites in the weekly newspapers are the personals. They're written by community correspondents who, like the scribes at the Amish newspaper, The Budget, they contribute church, social, and school-type news from their communities. If you've ever read a hometown newspaper, you know the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Who went out of town on a shopping trip? Who's sick in the hospital? Who was in church on Sunday? Like this one in the Bruton Standard. Mrs. Earlene Thrasher of Pollard had her gallbladder surgery on Tuesday. She has done real good, and the latest I have is that she'll probably be home on Monday. Not the kind of thing you would read in the New York Times. How about this from the Clark County Democrat in Grove Hill? Jeremy Dunnigan of Coffeyville celebrated his birthday March 5th, and his pet goat had twin babies the same day. And get ready for a real personal from the Greensboro Watchman. On Wednesday, July 13, Mr. and Mrs. Mickey Chanel and Mr. and Mrs. Sam Roper motored to Birmingham for an overnight stay at the Winfrey Hotel. The occasion was the celebration of the Ropers' 20th wedding anniversary. On Thursday morning, Mr. and Mrs. Chanel and Mrs. Roper went shopping at the Galleria, while Mr. Roper had a vasectomy. Both events were then celebrated with lunch at Applebee's. A good time was had by all. Let me also say that some of the names and places in this talk today have been altered somewhat to protect the innocent. Here's one from the TriCity Ledger in Flemington. Headline reads, "Runaway tire plows through Flemington trailer." A Flemington man was literally knocked off his bathroom toilet by a runaway tire last Friday in a bizarre accident. Benny Earl Johnson, who resides in a trailer near Highway 31, was in the bathroom Friday afternoon. A loaded log truck was southbound on the highway when a hub broke on the trailer and two tires came loose. One tire careened down the highway while the other one shot directly between an oak tree and plowed into Johnson's home and made a straight shot for the trailer's front door. The tire, which Davis estimated to be traveling about 60 miles an hour, knocked down the front door, knocked down a partition wall between the bedroom and the bathroom, and hit Johnson, who was sitting on the toilet. Johnson was temporarily wedged between the toilet and the wall when the tire slammed into him, knocking him to the floor. The tire came to rest on the toilet seat. I don't think he knew what hit him, but a young boy was riding a bicycle down the road and was an eyewitness to the whole thing. From the Advertiser Gleam in Gunnersville comes this item with the headline, "Took 9 people 5 hours to clean up the mess." There were peaches that she'd paid $13 a bushel for. There were apples, cucumbers, squash, beans, soup mix, just about anything you could put in a jar. They all came crashing down when a fruit cabinet pulled loose from the wall in the home of Ben and Otha Ryla Bachman at Friendship between Gunnersville and Arab. "It was terrible," she said. "We counted the tops of 273 jars that had broken. About 30 or 35 others spoiled because the lids were loosened." She doesn't like to think about how many hours had gone into preparing all that food. The cabinet fell at 4 p.m. while she was sitting on her front porch. It took 9 people to clean it up, and they didn't finish until 9 p.m. The cabinet was 8 feet long and built all the way to the ceiling. When it came loose, it crashed down across a bed in their extra bedroom. Besides the loss of food, it made a real mess in the room. Food splashed all over the walls, and the room had to be repainted. They had to replace the carpet because of all the glass splinters. They had to take 10 handmade quilts to the laundromat, plus blankets and pillows. When the cabinet fell, Mrs. Blackman thought it sounded like a car hitting the back of the house. Except there's no road there. Her next thought was that it might have been a helicopter. But when she ran into the room and the smell of the vegetable soup hit her, she knew what had happened. Speaking of the Advertiser, Gleam in Guntersville, is just about my all-time favorite hometown newspaper. This is from just a couple of weeks ago, and this little lady has killed a snake in her carport for 2 consecutive summers. She's only 5'4", and she's holding that snake, and you can see the snake is dragging the ground. The snake is longer than she is tall. I like to read the obituaries in the Advertiser Gleam. This weekly newspaper in the Sand Mountain town of Guntersville shows an interest in the lives of people of all classes that's not found in those boring and tedious obituaries in the big city dailies. Like this obituary. Coley Wayne Brown, a retired Guntersville service station attendant, dropped dead Wednesday night while at a revival service at the Friendship Baptist Church. Mr. Brown, who was 78, had said he was tired that night, but he hadn't been sick, and he and his wife Katie went to the revival. He collapsed during the song part of the music. Don Ryan, the church's music director, was leading the singing. The pastor, the Reverend Sherman Beasley, and the evangelist, the Reverend Clausell Griffin, were also on the rostrum. Mr. Brown, who was standing between his wife and Howard Broderick, as they started the 4th verse of the 2nd song, "Since I Have Been Redeemed," he fell into Mr. Braddock's arms. An ambulance was called and took him to the hospital, but he had apparently died instantly. It's thought he had a heart attack. The service was resumed after the ambulance left. 3 people were saved that night. You may have read in the newspaper or seen on CNN some years back when the publisher of the Advertiser Gleam, Mr. Porter Harvey, and there he is, he decided to bungee jump to celebrate his 90th birthday. There he is. Mr. Harvey died about a year later, but he continued to work a 40-hour week until about 3 weeks before his death. After the bungee jump, Mr. Harvey was contacted by Katie Couric, who was on the Today Show at that time. They wanted to fly him to New York City to appear on the Today Show. He declined. He said he didn't have time, that he had to go to work the next day to help get the newspaper out. Mr. Harvey's son, Sam, is the editor of the Advertiser Gleam, which happens to be the largest weekly newspaper in Alabama. Everything in the Advertiser Gleam is local. Sam says that President Obama won't get his name in his newspaper unless he visits in the county. Sam says his paper is known as the Big Turnip, 4-legged chicken paper. He says, we run more pictures of dead fish, dead rattlesnakes, and dead dogs than any weekly newspaper in the United States. One time, Sam ran a picture of a dead dog in the center of the road. A state highway striping crew striped right over the dog. Sam said, some people said it was terrible to run that picture. But others said that if the highway department people are so inefficient, it's good to have their ignorance exposed. As far as the photographs go in weekly papers, my favorite category is the big vegetable. Big watermelon, cantaloupe, tomatoes, sweet potatoes. 92-year-old Katherine Tucker Windham is a storyteller, writer, and former newspaper reporter who lives in Selma. She may be best known for her 13 Alabama Ghosts in Jeffrey book. Mrs. Windham worked at the Alabama Journal here in Montgomery in the 1940s during World War II. She wrote this book titled Odd Egg Editor, and I'm using it this semester in my news writing class at Auburn. And for the past 2 years, we've taken a field trip over to Selma for my students to get a chance to meet Mrs. Windham and to interview her. When she was a reporter at the Alabama Journal, her editor, Meriwether Lewis Sharpley, conferred upon her the title Odd Egg Editor. He told her that it was her duty to interview and write a story, sometimes with pictures, about anyone who brought a freakish article into the newsroom. Not just eggs, anything freakish. As Odd Egg Editor, she wrote about gourds that grew in the shape of animals, usually rabbits, fish that had swallowed knives, coins, and jewelry, okra pods 4 feet long, fruit trees that blossomed out of season, albino squirrels, triple ears of corn, dogs that could bark Dixie, three-legged chickens, sows nursing kittens, tomatoes growing on potato vines and vice versa, 12-pound turnips, and peaches misshapen into the likeness of Winston Churchill. She wrote about odd eggs brought into the newsroom, dozens of them. After Pearl Harbor, there was a proliferation of eggs bearing prophetic messages on their shells, usually in Japanese. One of the finest of the odd eggs was laid by Mrs. M.T. Law's Dominecker hen in Deatsville. The egg had maps of the major Allied countries outlined on its shell. One woman brought an egg to the newsroom that was embossed with what she interpreted as a number predicting the end of World War II. Mrs. Windham said she told Mrs. Windham that she intended to keep the egg right beside her Bible. She said she felt that the hen was divinely inspired. Speaking of 12-pound turnips, I took a lot of turnip pictures when I worked on community newspapers. The whopper turnip roots that gardeners bring into the office. I look over here and I see my friend Clark Bruner. Clark and I worked together at the Bruton Standard, and I worked with his mother, Doris Bruner. One year at the Bruton Standard, Doris and I started running turnip pictures with the names and the pictures of the gardeners, like that one. It seemed that each gardener tried to outdo the previous record holder. Doris and I even threatened to have a full-fledged turnip contest. We thought that would be interesting. One day, a woman came to the office, and she had 2 giant turnip roots. She held one on either side, and I took a photograph, and Doris wrote a headline that said, 2 big ones. I probably learned more about journalism from my friend Doris than I ever learned in college. There was an article in the Times Daily in Florence, Alabama, earlier this summer about the warming temperatures in August and how hot weather brings increased snake activity. The snake, a cold-blooded creature, responds to hot weather by becoming more active. Hot weather and snakes remind me of Doris and the story she wrote about the snake in the Dewberry patch. It was 29 years ago. I was at the Bruton Standard, and it was the summer of 1981. We were between Little League and high school football. It was miserably hot, and things were dull. People kept asking us, why don't y'all write something about the snake in the Dewberry patch? During that hot summer, and we really were in a heat wave that summer, the story of the snake in the Dewberry patch was told in coffee shops, at garden club meetings, governmental and board meetings, laundromats, churches. I recount for you the story. A man drives by and he sees a car in a wooded area and there are children inside. Much later he returns and the children are still in the car. He asks them if they're alone and they say, Mama's gone dewberry picking. He calls out for her. Hearing no response, he starts to investigate. Off by the dewberry vines, in a ditch, he finds the woman dead, the victim of a venomous bite. The woman has a death grip on the rattlesnake, which she has killed. That's the story. As we investigated this horrible tale, which everyone told us really happened, we found many variations with locations and people changing. For example, discovery was made by a state trooper. Discovery was made by an Escambia, or a Conecuh, or a Covington, or a Baldwin, or a Monroe, or a Clark County Sheriff's deputy. Discovery was made by a pulpwood worker on his way to work. Other variations had the children sitting in the car for 2 hours, 3 hours, or from the time somebody went to work and found them until later that afternoon, they were still in the car. In some of the accounts that we were given, the rattlesnake became a moccasin. It happened in Atmore. It happened in Pollard. It happened in Castleberry. It happened down around Baldwin County. It happened over toward Bermuda in Conecuh County. We made local and long-distance calls to law enforcement agencies, hospitals, rescue squads, funeral homes. But we were never able to substantiate the story. It just didn't happen. Doris wrote a story anyway reporting that the snake in the Dewberry patch wasn't true. And there's the story. I shivered one time when I saw a picture in the Tallahassee Tribune in Elmore County, and it had a cut line that read something like this. Bud Dean holds a 5-foot 11 rattle diamondback rattlesnake that he killed last week. Bud said the big rattler attacked his car tire and doggone near punctured it before the snake was done in. Photo by Jack Venable from a distance. Jim Cox at the Clark County Democrat in Grove Hill told me about the time that someone killed a rattlesnake on the highway, and they put the snake in the trunk of the car, take it to the newspaper office to get a photo shot. Well, it turns out the snake wasn't actually dead. When they opened the trunk of the car in the newspaper parking lot, the snake had apparently revived himself, and he was coiled, ready to strike. We'll always talk about snakes. It makes me think of the Clayton Record. It's the hometown newspaper of the late Governor George Wallace. Once in the 1960s, when Wallace was running for president, he appeared on NBC's Meet the Press, and he was asked the name of his favorite newspaper. Is it the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post? No, said Wallace, it's my hometown newspaper, the Clayton Record, Barber County, Alabama. Miss Bertie Parrish, the late editor of the Clayton Record, told me once that after Wallace's comment on Meet the Press that she got requests for newspaper subscriptions all over the world, even from Russia. The Clayton Record was known for its fantastic rattlesnake stories. Many years ago, when Miss Bertie's father, the late William Lee Gamble, was editor and publisher, a rattlesnake story always makes super news, he used to say. The Gambles and Miss Parrish were proud that Barber County was the home of governors, including George Wallace, and they said they would never endorse a candidate for governor unless he or she was a native Barber Countian. Both Pearl and Bill Gamble and their daughter Bertie were inducted to the Alabama Newspaper Hall of Honor on the Auburn campus. Mrs. Gamble was the first woman to register to vote in Barber County. She was one of the founders of the Clayton Study Club. She was active in the Clayton Music Club, and she was a longtime member of the Clayton United Methodist Church, where she was a choir director. Miss Gamble liked to write about the bridge parties and the showers and the weddings and engagements and teas, the social news. But her husband liked writing about hunting and fishing. Mr. Gamble was fond of collecting rattlesnake stories. Every farmer who killed or captured a rattlesnake would bring it by Mr. Gamble's office at the Clayton Record. It said that quite a collection of snakes and snake stories were accumulated, and Mrs. Gamble scolded him about it. He made the statement once after his wife kidded him about printing the snake stories and the snake pictures, that if a woman can get her picture in the paper for playing bridge, then any man who kills a rattlesnake can get his name in my newspaper. I like the dead animal pictures in hometown papers. Turkey, the weight of the bird, the length of the beard. Deer, the size, the weight, the points, what it was shot with. Fish, where it was caught and what the fish was caught with. Rattlesnakes, the length, the number of rattles, where it was killed. Working on small town papers like I did was really a learning experience in all facets of Southern culture. The typical community newspaper contains a record of weekly events, some profound, as I said, and some not so profound, that influence our lives. While working at the weekly papers in Jackson, Alabama, Brewton, Atmore, Monroeville, Grove Hill, Andalusia, I wrote stories about dinner on the grounds, cemetery cleanings, Decoration Day on the first Sunday in May. I wrote about the arrival in early February of the first Purple Martin Scout of the year. I wrote about the first hummingbird in the spring. I wrote about Sacred Heart singings, whippoorwill storms, tent revivals, rolling stores, cane syrup making, chitlin suppers, peanut boilings, watermelon cuttings. I learned that there are 3 kinds of lace that you write about in a wedding story. I also learned how to spell chrysanthemum, petit four, and hors d'oeuvre. There's another name for hometown newspapers, and not to be considered derogatory. It's country journalism. Writing about people who were not necessarily well educated or famous, people who probably were not known outside of their churches and their communities. They never aspired for public office, and they never left the town where they were born. The saying goes that most people's names are only published in the paper 2 times, when they're born and when they die. And I learned that one of the worst mistakes a newspaper could commit was to misspell a name or get a fact wrong in a birth announcement or in an obituary. Some call this family Bible journalism, writing about the kinds of things that really do matter to people, all the news that's fit to print. Maybe a birth, a death, a wedding, a photo of 5 generations of a family that's clipped from the Bible and tucked away in the family Bible to be kept for generations. A longtime good friend of mine, Joe Thomas, serves this year as the president of the Alabama Press Association. Joe's the editor and publisher of the weekly TriCity Ledger in Flomaton. Joe calls it refrigerator journalism. He told me that he wanted his paper to be on every refrigerator door in the county. The kind of news he was talking about: school menus, honor rolls, a picture of their child's Little League team, or a special recipe from the cook of the week. Joe says that the best testimony of the longevity of a community newspaper is to see the clippings in scrapbooks and on refrigerators and in Bibles plastered on the walls. Joe says that people come up to him all the time and say that they still have clippings years later when their name and picture were in the newspaper. You know, you don't clip from the internet. I don't recall any newspaper website or any non-newspaper website printing school honor rolls, children's birthday parties, or Bubba showing off his big squash, tomato, turnip, or rattlesnake that he killed in his hunting camp. Those stories and pictures are priceless, and they're the lifeblood of good community journalism. Hometown newspapers are the foundation of a community, and they provide an identity and a cohesiveness to a town. There was a time when most small town papers were locally owned, but that is rapidly becoming a thing of the past. I don't know the percentage of papers in Alabama that are locally owned, but it is a decreasing number. In many instances, when a newspaper sells to a large chain, they receive an infusion of capital that can mean more and better staff members and more equipment, and in the end could result in a better newspaper. But there are other times when a town loses something when it no longer has a newspaper that's locally owned. Oftentimes the editor and the publisher are more interested in making money, impressing the corporate headquarters, and moving on to a bigger newspaper in a bigger city than they are with providing that community with a quality hometown paper. A small-town hometown weekly paper isn't a daily paper, and it shouldn't act like one or be treated like one. While a small-town paper must print the so-called hard news, it has a greater obligation to report the little things: the school news, the local sports, the social items, the big snakes and the turnips, the catfish, the 8-point bucks, the ladies' fruit cabinet that went crashing to the floor, the snake in the Dewberry patch. A small-town paper should have a homey, conversational flavor that large daily metropolitan papers can't have because of their larger audiences. While a small-town paper has to make pictures of dead rattlesnakes, unusual vegetables, and more, it must also cover the real news of the area, the crime, the arrests, city-county governments, the courts, industrial development, school boards, banking, real estate, and more. Hometown papers print it all, and a hometown paper ought to give a community its identity. Will Rogers, the best-loved humorist in America, was also one of the best-informed people of his time. All I know is what I read in the papers became his trademark. Will Rogers recommended that newspapers, more than any other medium, are the common source of all people. Rogers said that any person who doesn't read at least one well-written country newspaper is not truly informed. The hometown paper has been one of the most visible institutions in America. It has functioned alongside the country store, the rural church, and the school as a common man's institution. The so-called common people of the South have left few personal records to tell their story. Instead, their history is preserved in the community newspaper. I'm honored to be here today to participate in the Alabama History Lecture sponsored by the Friends of Alabama Archives. And you know, journalism is the first draft of history. More than any other medium, the newspaper serves as a historical record. History books would be far less adequate without access to day-to-day records of newspapers down through the years. If a person wants to get a sense of what life was like in the 1940s, all he has to do is flip through the old issues of the paper and see what events were on people's minds, the movies they were seeing, and the products that were being advertised. There in black and white are the births and the deaths and the openings and the closings of everything from schools to industries to church happenings, political news, club projects, and the never-ending acts of crime. I hope that community newspapers will be here for a long time. There's always another story to tell, another feature to write, another spelling bee winner to find herself on the refrigerator door, and another obituary to wind up in the family Bible. Some of the news is good, some of it's bad, but the facts were reported like they were, and future generations only have to glance back over the pages of a community newspaper to get a clear picture of the past. It was Thomas Wolfe who wrote that you can't go home again, but you know, you really can do anything you want. You can go to hometowns that you never even had. All you have to do is pick up a hometown newspaper. Thank you.
Now we have time for questions. Please raise your hand if you have a question for Dr. Williams. We will get the microphone to you, and please speak directly into the microphone.
Yes.
Really isn't about community journalism, but why do you think there's such an absence of investigative journalism statewide?
Well, you know, I won't pretend that all newspapers are doing just fine. I think that newspapers in this recession are hurting just like any other business. And newspapers are cutting back on pages. There's a loss of advertising, which affects the number of pages. They're cutting back on staff. And you know, when they cut back on staff, the public suffers because there's just not the investigative reporting out there. There's just not much of it going on. I think that the cutbacks have affected that.
Yes, you mentioned the Advertiser Gleam.
Yes, sir.
I'm a subscriber, and I think the obituaries are priceless there because, you know, they talk about what the person liked. You know, they were a big Alabama fan, they were a big Auburn fan, etc. So you really get a feel for the people. But one thing in those newspapers that I miss was the old 50 years ago and 100 years ago which I think, you know, people really look forward to that because they could really connect with the community. You know, you just don't see that much anymore, and I just wondered if, you know, the 100 or 50 years ago thing, would you comment on that?
Well, you know, papers I worked at, I used to love to do those. Sometimes during a lunch break, I would go back and get out a bound volume, and I'd start looking through there at 25 years ago, 50 years ago, and start compiling. Next thing I knew, everybody in the office there was standing over my shoulders, and then I'd finish, and they'd want to leave the bound volume out because they wanted to look at it some more. I mean, people love to look at those, and also those old photographs. Why papers are not doing it, I don't know. Speaking of the Advertiser Gleam, I first became familiar with that paper when I was in college, and I had some friends from Guntersville, and the paper comes out twice a week, and my friends couldn't wait for that newspaper to come, and I would go to their apartment, and we would sit around and read the Advertiser Gleam, and I didn't even know the people in that newspaper. And when a friend of mine from Guntersville's father passed away, Sam Harvey, the editor, called her mother to get all kinds of information. I mean, they treat each person like they're a special person, and it really meant a lot to the family. A few years ago, I went to Birmingham, and I spoke to fourth graders on Alabama history, and I talked about newspaper journalism, and I asked the kids if they read a newspaper, and one little boy, and I shared this with Sam Harvey, the Advertiser Gleam. He loved it. This was in Birmingham, and he said, "We get the Advertiser Gleam at our house." I mean, people that don't live there, but they want to keep up, or people that just enjoy reading it. I subscribed to the Budget, the first paper I showed you. I subscribed this summer just because even though I could read it online, I just wanted to get a feel of the paper. Yes.
Is a journalism curriculum in college today much different than it was 25 or 30 years ago?
It is. I mean, we're still doing the basics, and the basics will always be there. And I teach an intro class at Auburn called Journalism 1100. I see Sally over there. Sally, did you take that class? It's called JM 101. Were you in my class? That class has not changed since it was founded in 1974. It's basics of good word usage. What's the difference in using affect and effect, capital and capital, willful, how you spell it. It's been updated. I've added words like Osama bin Laden and Internet and World Wide Web and email. There are changes to it, but that basic class at Auburn University has been around since 1974. What's in there, Sally? Spelling, word usage, AP style, things that never change. There are things that we've added. We've introduced a class on convergence, where the students are learning to videotape and streaming video, and how to serve as a reporter and as a photographer and as a photojournalist, and tape it so that the video can also be there. Aren't y'all doing that at the Montgomery Advertiser, Al? The reporters are videotaping along with being a reporter. So I think that some of the basics are there and will never change, but journalism programs are implementing new things because they have to in the 21st century if our students are going to be competitive for jobs when they graduate. Al?
How about the courage that it takes in a small town paper? I've worked on several of them. When you come across, and Goodloe Sutton comes to mind. We all know Goodloe. And he did some stuff, exposed a crooked sheriff, and not every weekly paper would have done that.
Okay. Al was talking about courageous editors in the state, and a lot of people won't display that kind of courage. And there was a publisher, Goodloe Sutton, with the Democrat reporter in Linden, who exposed a corrupt sheriff. And I mean, his wife is deceased now, and she was the principal reporter for that. And I think she was nominated for a Pulitzer. And I mean, they got death threats about what they did. I think that in some communities, the editors and reporters there don't stay long enough to ever learn the community. In others, it just takes a lot of courage to do that. I mean, it takes a lot of courage to make editorial endorsements for local candidates. I've seen papers that will endorse candidates for president or for governor, but they won't endorse a person for mayor or city council or county commission within their communities.
Dr. Williams? How do you recommend preserving old newspaper clippings that you find in scrapbooks that are becoming very brittle?
Do I see Ed Bridges over there? You know, I say I'm a pack rat, and I worked at the Bruton Standard 30 years ago, and I saved a copy of each issue. And like when I went through there to find this one with Doris and the snake in the Dewberry batch, that paper from 1981 was already starting to break. And I've also noticed because of the width of the newspapers, they were so wide then, it's hard to keep it. I don't know. Could you answer that question, Ned?
Well, I'll take a stab. I mean, for one thing, all these newspapers are printed on wood pulp, so the chemicals that are in there from the very start are going to break down and cause these papers to deteriorate. It's just built in. And the more they get warm or the more they get sunlight, the faster that process is going to take place. That's why when you leave them out in the sun all day long, they're already yellowed when you take them in. So the only way to really stop that is to de-acidify the paper. And there are sprays that you can get from archival supply houses that allow you to stop that acid breakdown from going on. So you can go online and get a de-acidification spray and then probably put it in a plastic sleeve. And actually, we have some of those plastic sleeves on sale over in our gift shop. We buy them in bulk, but you can also order them. But those two things, to stop the acid from breaking down the paper, you have to de-acidify it. Otherwise, even if you put it in pretty good environment, it's still going to break down over the course of 50 or 100 years.
Yeah, I would think that with clippings, just photocopying the clipping you could keep it longer than the actual clipping itself, also. Yeah. Or you could scan it and keep it on your computer and hope your computer doesn't crash. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions?
There's something like 25 dailies and 100 weeklies in the state of Alabama.
I've got a question. What are there any cases that you know of? Are there many cases where when the newspaper sells out to some chain, the quality stays up and it's still a good local newspaper?
I think that would be open to debate, where the people who bought it would say that it's a better newspaper, and sometimes I think it is. And sometimes when a newspaper is owned by a chain, they're providing what they can provide on the revenue that comes into the paper in that community, and I think many times they're providing the best they can with the size of the community and the amount of advertising they have. And I wouldn't want to make it sound like a newspaper is bought by a chain and it goes down for the worse. I think there are some that are owned by chains who are trying and doing a good job. But I think the flavor, I have a good friend, Jim Cox, that I mentioned, the Clark County Democrat in Grove Hill. There have only been about 4 owners of that newspaper in its 150-year history. And Jim has the bound volume from every issue, and he has studied every issue, and he can tell you everything about that community because he's lived there his whole life. And you don't see that very much. And I think that the people there in Grove Hill and in Clark County maybe don't appreciate what they have when they have a local newspaper and a local owner who's going to stay there and who really knows the community and cares about it.
Are any of those weeklies and dailies in Alabama owned by the retirement systems of Alabama?
That's some of the papers are owned by the state retirement systems. It's community. It's Community Newspaper Holdings Incorporated. I believe they own the Coleman Times. I'm not sure what else.
Dr. Williams will be here for a few minutes. If you have a question you'd like to ask, thank you so much for coming, and thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.